The camera fades in on an empty church in Newark, New Jersey. A single light glows above the pulpit. The faint echo of a choir drifts through the air, voices rising, falling, then disappearing into silence. Somewhere in that sound, you can almost hear her, the woman who taught the world what a true voice sounds like. Before the bright lights, before the fame of her daughter, there was a singer whose faith was stronger than any spotlight. Her songs didn't just reach the charts, they reached hearts. What happens when the world forgets the woman who once gave it its greatest sound? This is the story of Cissy Houston, the gospel legend who gave birth to an icon. Let's get into her story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of tea or water, sit back, and let's start this journey together. She was born Emily Drinkard on the 30th of September 1933 in Newark, New Jersey, the youngest of 8 children in a home where faith and music were not separate things, but one and the same. Her father, Nicholas, worked hard to provide for his family. Her mother, Delia May, carried the spirit of the South inside her, a quiet strength born from struggle and prayer. Cissy's grandfather had once owned land in Blakely, Georgia, a rare thing for a black man in those years. That legacy of dignity, of independence, was the soil from which her voice would one day rise. When she was just 5 years old, life brought its first great test. Her mother suffered a stroke. The house fell into silence, heavy and uncertain, until her father gathered the children together and said, "Sing for her." And they did. Their young voices filled the room, trembling but pure, lifting not just their mother's spirit, but their own. That was when little Emily learned the first truth about music, that it could heal what medicine could not. From that day on, singing became more than sound. It was family, it was prayer, it was survival. She and her siblings formed a small gospel quartet called the Drinkard Four, singing in their local church and nearby congregations. The crowds weren't large, but the faith was. Their harmonies echoed through wooden pews and dusty sunlight, a sound that felt bigger than the room itself. Then came loss again. Between 1941 and 1942, her mother passed away from a brain hemorrhage. 10 years later, her father died of stomach cancer. By the time she was still barely a young woman, Cissy knew what it meant to stand on her own. After her parents' passing, she moved in with her older sister Lee and her husband, Mansell Warwick. Their home was already full, filled with children, music, and the laughter of 2 little girls named Dion and Dee Dee Warwick. Those girls would one day find their own place in the history of soul. But back then, they were just family, the next generation of the Drinkard sound. Cissy attended Southside High School in Newark, graduating in 1952. But her education had begun long before the classroom, in the choir lofts and street corners where gospel harmonies shaped her faith and her fire. By the early 1950s, she joined with her siblings again to form the Drinkard Singers, a refined version of the family quartet. They sang with the kind of conviction that could only come from people who had lived what they were singing about. In October 1951, a radio announcer named Joe Bostic invited them to perform at Carnegie Hall for the first ever Negro Gospel and Religious Music Festival. For the Drinkards, it wasn't just a stage, it was history. Imagine it. The polished floors of Carnegie Hall, the smell of old wood and fresh anticipation. A group of gospel singers from Newark stepping into a world that wasn't built for them yet, singing as if it always had been. When the applause came, it wasn't just for their voices. It was for everything they represented: faith, endurance, and a quiet revolution in harmony. That night marked the beginning of a legacy. Soon, the group became regulars on Bostic's radio show, The Gospel Train. By 1954, they were performing alongside Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Mahalia Jackson at the Newport Jazz Festival, the first gospel group ever to do so. 2 of their live performances were recorded and released on albums, preserving that raw, thunderous energy for generations to come. In 1958, RCA Victor Records signed them, releasing A Joyful Noise, one of the first gospel albums ever produced by a major label. It wasn't just a musical achievement, it was a cultural milestone. Through all the changes, the tours, the studio sessions, the early fame, Cissy remained grounded in the sound that had shaped her life. She wasn't chasing the world. She was carrying a piece of her mother, her church, her roots into every note. By the end of 1962, the Drinkard Singers had quietly dissolved. But Cissy wasn't finished. In her heart, there was still a song left to be sung, one that would take her far beyond Newark, into the heart of American music. Before the world knew Whitney Houston, before the name Houston became synonymous with greatness, there was a young woman standing in front of a microphone, eyes closed, voice trembling with faith. That was Cissy, and this was where it all began. When the Drinkard Singers began to fade, Cissy Houston stood at a crossroads. The world outside the church doors was changing gospel, was giving birth to soul, and a new generation of singers was taking their faith from the pulpit to the recording studio. For Cissy, that shift wasn't rebellion, it was evolution. In the early 1960s, she began working as a session singer, one of those invisible voices that gave warmth and life to the records people couldn't stop playing. Behind her quiet demeanor was a power that producers quickly learned to recognize. She could match pitch with anyone, blend perfectly into a harmony, or lift an entire song with just one note. Soon, she helped form a group that would define an era, the Sweet Inspirations. Alongside Doris Troy, Dee Dee Warwick, and Sylvia Shemwell, Cissy became part of a sisterhood of sound. They weren't just background singers. They were the backbone of American soul. Their harmonies graced records by some of the biggest names in music. When Aretha Franklin sang about respect, they were the ones echoing her demand. When Elvis Presley returned to the stage in his legendary late 6-0 comeback, it was Cissy's voice that filled the spaces between the king's words. But there was more to her gift than power, it was precision. Cissy could adapt to any style, gospel, soul, rock, or pop. In one week, she might sing behind Wilson Pickett, Dusty Springfield, or Jimi Hendrix. She was everywhere and nowhere at once, her sound familiar to millions, her name known to few. It wasn't easy work. Studio sessions ran late into the night, and she often came home just in time to make breakfast for her children. By then, she was a mother of 3, Gary, Michael, and her youngest, Whitney. While she chased harmonies in New York studios, her husband John managed the logistics of her career, ensuring that the Houston name stayed steady even when the world spun fast around them. People in the industry respected her, but the spotlight was never hers to hold. Cissy didn't chase fame, she chased the perfect take, the perfect tone, the perfect truth inside every song. Yet, somewhere deep down, she must have wondered what it would feel like to have her own name on the record sleeve. By the mid-1960s, the Sweet Inspirations had signed with Atlantic Records. They were more than session singers now, they were artists in their own right, releasing records that carried both the ache of gospel and the groove of soul. Their sound was church and city all at once, sacred fire wrapped in rhythm. Cissy had found her place in the changing world of American music. Still, there was something stirring inside her, a quiet voice that whispered, "It's time." After years of standing behind the microphone for others, she was ready to step forward. The woman who had once sung to heal her mother was about to sing for herself. In 1963, the same year she gave birth to her daughter Whitney, Cissy Houston made another kind of debut, one that would quietly echo through decades of American music. That year, she released her first solo single, a small gospel track that carried the weight of generations behind it. It didn't top the charts, but it opened a door she had been knocking on since childhood. Cissy had spent years helping others find their voice. Now, she was finally ready to claim her own. Her first singles under her real name, "This Is My Vow" and "Bring Him Back," were tender, faithful songs that merged gospel devotion with soul longing. They didn't fit neatly into radio formats, but they carried something timeless conviction. In 1967, Atlantic executive Jerry Wexler, who had already seen the magic she created with the Sweet Inspirations, offered her a chance to record under her own name. She said yes, but on her terms. That year marked her transition from group harmonies to individual artistry. It was both liberation and risk. Her early solo work captured the sound of a woman balancing 2 worlds, faith and ambition, motherhood and music, the church and the stage. Her first full-length album, presenting Cissy Houston, was released in 1970 under Commonwealth United Records. It was a record filled with warmth, depth, and undeniable spirit. Songs like "I'll Be There" and "Be My Baby" climbed the R&B charts, introducing her to a wider audience that had unknowingly been hearing her for years. But as often happens in the music industry, recognition didn't come in proportion to talent. Her versions of Be My Baby and I'll Be There carried emotional fire, yet they were overshadowed by the fame of others. Still, Cissy didn't waver. She knew what she had. Then came the song that should have changed everything, Midnight Train to Georgia. Cissy recorded it first, pouring into it the ache of every dreamer who ever had to leave the lights behind. But months later, Gladys Knight and the Pips re-recorded it, and their version went to the top of the charts. For Cissy, it was both a victory and a heartbreak. She had carried the song across the tracks, only to watch someone else arrive at the station. That moment defined her grace. Instead of bitterness, she kept singing in studios, in churches, in concerts where her name might not be on the marquee, but her sound filled the air. Her voice remained unmistakable, part honey, part hurricane. Through the 1970, she continued to release albums, including Cissy Houston, 1977, and Think It Over, 1978, produced by Michael Zager. The latter gave her a hit on both the R&B and disco charts. Songs like Think It Over and Warning, Danger proved she could adapt to the times without losing her soul. She had earned respect from musicians, producers, and audiences who understood what authenticity sounded like. But commercial fame, that still eluded her. Cissy once said in an interview, "I never sang for attention. I sang because it was what I was born to do." By the end of the decade, she had lived multiple lives, a gospel pioneer, a background singer, a mother, and now a respected solo artist. The stage lights had found her at last. But even then, she never forgot where the light came from. As the 1970 drew to a close, her sound evolved, but her message stayed the same: faith, love, and endurance. What she didn't yet know was that her greatest legacy was growing quietly in her own home, watching her, learning from her every note. The world would soon know the name Whitney Houston. But before that name filled arenas and broke records, it was whispered in the same kitchen where a mother once hummed a hymn over the sound of morning coffee. By the late 1970s, Cissy Houston had become something rare in American music, a singer equally at home in the church, the studio, and the nightclub. Her voice carried the weight of gospel truth but could glide through disco rhythms with ease. She didn't chase trends, she transcended them. In 1977, she released her self-titled album Cissy Houston under Private Stock Records, produced by Michael Zager. The sound was sleek, alive, a reflection of the era's confidence. Then came Think It Over in 1978, the record that finally placed her name where it belonged, on the charts, in the spotlight, and in the conversation. The single Think It Over rose to number 32 on the R&B charts and number 5 on the disco charts. It wasn't just a hit, it was a statement. In a time when music was becoming more mechanical, Cissy's voice remained deeply human. She could turn a studio booth into a sanctuary. Her phrasing was deliberate, emotional, like each note had lived a life before it was sung. Critics praised her for bridging the gap between spiritual music and mainstream soul, calling her the purest gospel voice to ever cross over. The industry finally began to see her not just as Whitney's mother or the background voice behind Aretha and Elvis, but as an artist in her own right. Record executives admired her professionalism. Younger singers studied her technique. She was, in many ways, the embodiment of what it meant to endure graceful under pressure, faithful through change. When she signed with Columbia Records in the early 1980s, her sound evolved again. Albums like Warning, Danger, and Step Aside for a Lady kept her on the radio, her songs blending gospel fire with urban polish. Tracks such as It Doesn't Only Happen at Night and You're the Fire reached the top 25 on the disco charts, proving she could still move with the rhythm of a new generation. But beneath the success, Cissy never forgot the stage that had raised her. She continued to sing in churches across New Jersey, often showing up unannounced, standing among choirs that had grown up idolizing her. For those who heard her live, it was unforgettable, a moment where heaven and music met in one voice. There was a particular night in Newark when she sang He's Got the Whole World in His Hands. The crowd stood still, swaying softly, some with tears running down their cheeks. In that moment, you could see why people called her the anchor, the steady soul at the center of so many musical storms. Cissy had reached the kind of success that didn't always come with trophies or headlines, but with something deeper: respect. In the unpredictable rhythm of fame, she had found her own beat, steady, soulful, and everlasting. And yet, while she stood in her own light, another star was beginning to rise, one that would carry her reflection across the world. Fame, in Cissy Houston's world, was never the goal. But during those late 1970 and early 1980 years, it found her anyway. She was performing in packed clubs, appearing on national television, recording songs that climbed the charts, yet somehow she was still standing in the shadows. For every magazine cover celebrating new stars, there was a quiet truth the public didn't see. Many of those new voices had learned how to sing by studying her. Cissy's technique, the control, the emotional precision, the effortless runs had become the invisible standard for generations to come. But being the foundation means being unseen. She gave others wings, and the world rarely looked down to notice who had lifted them. At home, her life was both ordinary and extraordinary. Her husband, John Russell Houston, managed her affairs while she balanced recording sessions with Motherhood. The youngest, Whitney, was already showing a voice that could silence a room. Sometimes Cissy would hear her daughter humming in the hallway, notes so pure they felt like echoes of her own youth. It must have filled her with both pride and a quiet kind of fear. She had walked this path, and she knew how beautiful and how brutal it could be. By the mid-1980, Whitney's career began to take off. Record labels came calling, and soon the world would know her name. For Cissy, that moment was bittersweet, a mother's joy intertwined with a veteran singer's understanding of what success could cost. She had seen what fame could do, how it could lift people up and tear them apart in the same breath. Still, she stood behind her daughter completely. In interviews, she spoke about Whitney not as a prodigy, but as a blessing. She was born to sing, Cissy said once, her tone steady but proud. It's what she came here to do. Yet in her eyes, there was always that flicker of prayer that Whitney would never lose herself in the noise. While Whitney's name began to appear on billboards and album covers, Cissy continued her own journey quietly. She was invited to sing background on albums by Chaka Khan, Luther Vandross, and Diana Ross, a sign that her influence was still deeply respected by those who knew. She might not have been in the spotlight, but her voice still moved through the airwaves of America, familiar as memory itself. There's a certain kind of melancholy that follows artists like Cissy, those who spend a lifetime giving their voice to others. The applause fades faster when you're not the one standing center stage. But Cissy didn't measure her worth in applause. She measured it in moments in the honesty of her sound, in the way people closed their eyes when she sang. In the late 1980s, she recorded a duet with Whitney called I Know Him So Well. For a few minutes, mother and daughter became one voice, past and future, wisdom and youth, the teacher and the student, bound together by sound. It was more than a performance. It was an inheritance. Standing beside her daughter under those lights, Cissy must have felt something beyond pride, perhaps relief, perhaps fear, perhaps both. She had given Whitney the tools to conquer the world, but she also knew that the world could take as easily as it gives. As the applause rolled over them that night, she smiled quietly, knowingly. She had lived long enough to see her dream reborn in her child. Yet deep inside, she also knew. Every song has its silence, and every light casts a shadow. When the 1980s gave way to a new decade, the music world that Cissy Houston had helped build began to change. The radio no longer echoed the gospel-infused soul she had once mastered. Pop and synthesizers ruled the airwaves, now smooth, digital, and far removed from the raw humanity of her voice. Cissy didn't fight the tide. She simply stepped back. For years, she had been both artist and mother, singer and mentor, the anchor of a family whose lives were inseparable from music. Now, she found herself in a different rhythm, quieter, slower, more reflective. She didn't disappear completely. Her voice could still be heard on the albums of giants Luther Vandross, Chaka Khan, Diana Ross. Every time she sang background, she brought a depth those songs didn't know they needed. Her voice was like a fingerprint, unmistakable to anyone who had truly listened. But away from the studio, she was also grappling with time. Her marriage to John Houston had begun to fracture, and by 1991 they separated after nearly 3 decades together. For a woman who had spent her life singing about faith and endurance, it was a painful silence, one that no melody could fill. Still, her spirit remained unbroken. In interviews, she spoke not of loss, but of gratitude. "God's been good to me," she'd say, with that calm smile that only comes from surviving what others can't see. She began returning to her roots, focusing on gospel again, the music that had never betrayed her. Then, something remarkable happened. In 1996, at an age when most artists slow down, Cissy found herself at the top once more. Her album, Face to Face, won the Grammy Award for Best Traditional Soul Gospel Album. The following year, she repeated the feat with He Leadeth Me. It was a poetic symmetry after years of standing behind others. The spotlight had turned back toward her, even if only for a moment. Those Grammy nights weren't about trophies. They were about acknowledgement, the quiet kind that says, "We remember you. We always should have." Cissy continued recording and touring into her 60s, her voice still radiant with strength. In her concerts, there was no spectacle, no glitter, just truth, a woman, a microphone, and a lifetime of stories in every note. She once told a young choir, "The world will forget the song, but it won't forget the feeling." That was the essence of her art, not the fame, but the emotion that lingers long after the music stops. And yet, even as she sang of grace and redemption, the shadows in her life were only beginning to deepen. What comes after the music isn't always silence, sometimes it's an echo. For much of her life, Cissy Houston had learned how to turn pain into melody, but nothing could prepare her for the silence that followed Whitney's fall. In February 2012, when the news broke that Whitney Houston had died, the world mourned a legend. But for Cissy, it wasn't the loss of a superstar, it was the loss of a child. The same voice that once filled her home, the same laughter that echoed through the kitchen where music was born, was gone. People across the globe played Whitney's songs in tribute, but for Cissy, each note was a wound. Every lyric was a memory. She withdrew from public life, retreating into the only refuge she'd ever known, faith. In the quiet of her home, she prayed, not for answers, but for peace. There's a certain loneliness that fame can't touch, the kind that comes from outliving your own history. By then, Cissy had buried friends, siblings, and her husband. But losing Whitney was different. It was like losing her reflection. "She was my baby," she once said softly. "I knew her heart." In 2013, she released Remembering Whitney, my story of love, loss, and the night the music stopped. It wasn't written for headlines, it was written to heal. Through its pages, she spoke not as a celebrity's mother, but as a woman who had watched the brightest light of her life flicker out too soon. It was raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. Even in grief, she never turned bitter. She continued to attend church, often singing in small congregations, her voice slower, more fragile, but still full of grace. Those who saw her during those years said she carried both strength and sorrow in her eyes, the look of someone who had known every shape of love. She found comfort in the past, in gospel music, in her memories of the Drinkard Singers, and in the legacy her family had built. Her grandson, Gary, and granddaughter, Bobby Christina, both inherited pieces of the family gift, though tragedy would again strike too soon. As the years went on, time began to take its toll. In the late 2010 seconds, her health declined, and Alzheimer's disease slowly began to steal away what fame never could, her memories. But even when her mind faltered, music remained. Caretakers said that when gospel songs played in her room, she would hum softly, eyes closed, lips moving to words she no longer remembered but still believed. Cissy Houston passed away on the 7th of October 2024 at the age of 91. Her final days were quiet, no cameras, no spotlight, just hymns and family nearby. For a woman who spent her life giving sound to others, it was perhaps fitting that she left this world in silence. But that silence wasn't empty. It was sacred, the stillness after a song so powerful. The air still remembers its echo. Cissy Houston's story didn't end when the music stopped. In many ways, her legacy began where the applause faded, in the quiet spaces she left behind, in the voices she shaped, in the songs that still carried her fingerprints. For every artist who ever blended gospel passion with soul polish, Cissy's influence is there. You can hear it in the power of Aretha's crescendos, in the emotion of Whitney's ballads, in the phrasing of younger singers who never met her but somehow sing like they knew her heart. She was the bridge between the sacred and the secular, between Sunday morning choirs and Saturday night stages. When she returned to gospel full-time in the 1990s, It wasn't a retreat, it was a homecoming. Her albums Face to Face and He Leadeth Me didn't just win Grammys, they restored something deeper. They reminded the world that gospel wasn't a genre, it was a language of survival, one that had raised her from the pews of Newark to the halls of music history. Those records carried the same message she'd lived by, that faith and music were never meant to be separate. Her voice, still strong even in her 60s, wrapped around hymns with the same sincerity that once filled Carnegie Hall decades earlier. Critics called her the last matriarch of gospel soul, but to those who knew her, she was simply Miss Cissy, the woman who could turn any room into a sanctuary. Her students and collaborators often said that her rehearsals were like church intense, precise, spiritual. She demanded honesty in every note. Don't just sing the words, she would tell them. Sing what they mean. It wasn't technique she was teaching, it was truth. In New Jersey, she became a beloved mentor, working with community choirs and young singers who saw in her the embodiment of dignity and perseverance. She never carried herself like a star. She carried herself like a servant of the song. In 2014, she was inducted into the National Rhythm and Blues Hall of Fame, followed by the Gospel Image Award for Lifetime Achievement in 2015, and the New Jersey Hall of Fame in 2019. Each recognition was long overdue, a quiet correction by history for a woman who had never demanded anything from it. And still, Cissy remained humble. "Everything I've done," she once said, "I did because the Lord gave me a voice, and I was supposed to use it." Today, when people talk about Whitney Houston, they often speak of the voice. But those who know the story understand. The first voice came from her mother. Every time Whitney hit a note that shook the air, it was Cissy's training, Cissy's discipline, Cissy's spirit guiding her. Her influence wasn't just in the music, it was in the message. That talent means nothing without faith. That fame fades, but truth remains. And perhaps that's why, even now, long after her last song, when a gospel choir swells and a single voice rises above the rest, it still sounds a little like her. In the years following her passing, Cissy Houston's legacy has only grown stronger, not through headlines or awards, but through remembrance. When people speak her name now, it is not as a footnote to her daughter's fame, but as a pillar in her own right. The American music industry, often quick to celebrate the fleeting, eventually circled back to honor the eternal. Gospel historians began revisiting her recordings, critics reevaluated her solo albums, and younger singers discovered that the woman they had studied unknowingly, the phrasing, the tone, the grace, had a name: Cissy Houston. Clips of her old performances resurfaced online. Her eyes closed, one hand lifted, her voice trembling with conviction. In those moments, she didn't look like someone performing. She looked like someone praying. For millions rediscovering her music, that distinction mattered. She wasn't chasing applause, she was reaching for truth. In Newark, the city that raised her, her name became a symbol of pride. Churches still tell stories of Miss Cissy walking in on a Sunday morning and quietly joining the choir, her voice blending in until someone realized who she was. For the people of Newark, she was proof that greatness could come from their streets and still stay humble enough to return. Across the Atlantic, gospel choirs in London and Paris began covering her arrangements, honoring her influence on European soul music. In interviews, artists from South Africa to Brazil spoke of her as a spiritual ancestor, the woman whose voice reminded them of home, even oceans away. The recognition came not as an explosion, but as a ripple, gentle, steady, unstoppable. Like her own singing, it moved through time with patience and purpose. When The Preacher's Wife soundtrack, featuring both Whitney and Cissy, found new listeners decades later, fans were struck by the blend mother and daughter singing as one, each carrying the other's sound. For many, it became a reminder of how cyclical art can be, how one life's melody becomes another's harmony. Even Hollywood, a place often blind to subtle greatness, began to shift its tone. Documentaries and retrospectives started giving her rightful credit, not just as Whitney's mother, but as a gospel legend who had shaped American music from behind the scenes. There is something profoundly poetic about her recognition arriving after her passing the way. Light finally finds the corners it once overlooked. It mirrors her own message, that what is real will always endure, even if the world takes its time to notice. Cissy Houston's story now stands as both an inspiration and a reminder. For artists who feel unseen, for mothers who sacrifice in silence, for voices that echo behind the stars, her life proves that legacy isn't about being remembered by everyone. It's about being remembered truly by someone. And in that sense, Cissy will never fade. Her music, her faith, and her spirit continue to resonate in every gospel song, every soulful cry, and every artist brave enough to sing with honesty. Because the world may have taken decades to see her, but once it did, it understood.